Good morning. Good morning from Williamsburg, and good afternoon, good evening to folks joining us from various parts of the globe, from across the oceans. I'm Divya Grace Matthew, AidData's Associate Director of Policy Analysis. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this important conversation on the future of international development in Sub-Saharan Africa. This region has been at the center of global development effort for decades now and has a diverse bench of partners ranging from bilateral donors, multilateral institutions, philanthropies, civil society organizations, private sector actors, all working to advance development goals. These partnerships have brought significant progress in areas like health, education, infrastructure, but they've also faced challenges in adapting to shifting priorities, challenges with emerging realities on the ground. Now, this year's significant aid cuts have also underscored the fragility of development financing and the urgency of rethinking how we sustain impact, especially in a resource-constrained environment. And in response, initiatives like the Accra Reset have called for a fundamental shift in how development is conceived and how it's delivered. There's a move towards placing African priorities, leadership, and accountability at the center of the agenda. This reset is not just about doing more with less, it's also about doing things differently, with a greater emphasis on local ownership and innovative partnerships. At the same time, Sub-Saharan Africa stands at a critical juncture. It's home to some of the world's fastest growing populations and economies, yet still grappling with multidimensional poverty, climate vulnerability, and the need for inclusive growth. So, what bold ideas and partnerships will shape the next chapter of development for Sub-Saharan Africa? We're fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel with deep expertise and diverse perspectives to help us unpack this topic. So let's dive right in. To begin, my colleague Dr. Anna Horigoshi will discuss results from AidData's latest wave of our Listening to Leaders survey. Then I'm going to introduce our panelists and save time for questions from the audience. So please send us your questions in the chat and I'll read them out to our panelists. Before I hand things over to Anna, let me briefly introduce AidData. We are a research lab based at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. We're a multidisciplinary team. We have political scientists, economists, computational geographers, software developers, historians, policy analysts, you name it, we've got them on our crew. We're all in pursuit of answers to the questions, who is funding what, where, and to what effect? It's been a busy year at AidData. We've recently launched a global data set on Chinese development financing, an updated version of the beloved data set that's been online for 16 years now. At this event, we're pleased to celebrate 10 years of our in-house survey called Listening to Leaders, fondly referred to as LTL. And we're also happy to launch a 2-page brief summarizing the Sub-Saharan Africa results for the 2024 wave of the survey. I'm going to ask my colleagues to pop a link in the chat to the brief that's been published. For the past decade, Listening to Leaders has done more than lip service to coalescing voices from the Global South. Beginning at the transition from Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, we've systematically surveyed heads of state, elected officials, civil society and private sector actors, as well as development and diplomatic representatives in countries, academics, universities, think tanks, and the media to assess their development priorities, preferences, and partnerships. Anna, over to you for a deeper dive on LTL.
Thanks, Divya. Hi, my name is Anna Horigoshi. I'm a research scientist of AidData's policy analysis unit, and I'll be talking briefly about the next decade of development cooperation in Sub-Saharan Africa, really focusing on the series of elite surveys that we at AidData have been conducting for the past decade. Next slide. So first we'll start talking a little bit about what is listening to leaders and why it matters. This is a global elite survey that captures the pretty much the entirety of the global south right now, and it tries to capture the views and opinions of people that are involved with the policy-making process across the global south again. We have 4 flagship surveys capturing a decade of insights from leaders in up to 147 countries. The first wave of the survey happened in 2014 and the most recent one in 2024. And we asked respondents a number of questions about priorities in development and performance of different development donors. And we measure those performance rates for 130 plus different development partners. We take a very broad view of what are elites, and we include people that work for the government, in-country representatives of development partners, people that work for non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, representatives of the private sector, and experts, which we define as including academics, people that work for media, and think tanks. And in the 2020 wave specifically, we also had parliamentarians. And you can see on the map, we have a great coverage of the global south, and that has expanded from wave to wave up to the most complete version we have in 2024, which includes pretty much the entirety of the global south and a few actually high-income countries too. Listening to Leaders has a systematic way of sampling elites. It's not a sample of convenience. We have targeted positions of interest from whom we want to hear, and we seek those contacts of those individuals across this set of 100 plus countries. Next slide, please. While the survey is global, in this presentation, we're going to focus a little bit on Sub-Saharan Africa as a region. We have some reports published about these flagship reports on a global scale, and there's some information on specific regions, but here we'll really narrow down on only Sub-Saharan Africa. We use the World Bank classification of Sub-Saharan Africa, and in the latest wave of the survey, we had 1,118 respondents from across Sub-Saharan Africa. We had people responding from 47 countries. And you can see the map on the side has kind of a color scale of the number of observations. You see that there is great variation on number of observations, but we also have pretty good coverage. Some of the countries that have most responses are Tanzania, Uganda, Benin, Botswana, and Nigeria. And we do, not to get too much in the weeds in the methods, but we do use non-response weights, so everything is balanced, even though some countries have more responses than others. Next slide, please. Okay, now jumping into some of the actual results. We have been asking respondents about what sectors, what areas of development they consider their top priority within their country since the 2017 wave. So we had 3 waves. For 3 waves, we have been asking respondents, what are the most important SDGs? We use the Sustainable Development Goals framework for that, and what they think are the top priorities within their countries. These results are specifically for the Sub-Saharan African region. And we note a couple main kind of insights. One is that quality education, strong institutions, and jobs are the top priorities for Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is very much in line with the global results. All these results on a global scale are published on our Prioritizing Agenda 2030 report, which was released in September this year. But narrowing down to Sub-Saharan Africa, we have consistency on those top priorities. And the main distinction with the global results is that zero hunger is a fairly high priority in Sub-Saharan Africa and not so high on a global scale. I think highlighting some focus from Sub-Saharan Africa leaders on basic needs. That is also true for the SDG related to clean water and sanitation, for example, it ranks higher than the results on a global scale. Since we're talking relative terms, these are the SDGs ranked, what is then deprioritized, relatively speaking, since zero hunger and clean water and sanitation are higher priorities. Climate action is relatively deprioritized in Sub-Saharan Africa in comparison to the global results. And another SDG that comes in a much lower ranking position is sustainable cities and communities. Next slide, please. And then jump into some of our results when talking about performance of different development partners. Again, not to get too much on the weeds of the methodology, but I'll explain a little bit what are the measures that we use when we're talking about development partners' performance. We first ask respondents from a very long list of the 130 plus development partners with whom they have engaged in the sense of received technical or financial assistance. That's what we call footprint. It's trying to measure presence of different development donors, development partners in a country. That's a baselining measure. And then amongst those respondents that said they had engaged with a given development partner, we asked how influential in setting up policy priorities and how helpful in implementing those policies this development partner was. So what we're capturing here is among the people that have engaged with a given development partner, how influential or helpful they find them to be. Again, these results were also released on a previous report on a global scale. The Listening to Leaders 2025 Development Cooperation Over a Decade of Disruption was released in April of this year, but focusing more on Sub-Saharan Africa, we find some insights that may be in contrast to the global results. So first, the footprint looks pretty similar between Sub-Saharan Africa and the global scale, and that's largely because our sampling frame is actually very robustly represented by Sub-Saharan Africa. The main difference is the presence of the African Development Bank. It comes in a very high position as the third largest development partner in the region, which makes sense because the African Development Bank has a regional mandate. So it doesn't really come across very high on the global scale. It's more of a middle of the pack, around the 15th to 20th position. But it comes as third in Sub-Saharan Africa, behind only World Bank and UNDP, which are consistently like some of the largest players, as it is probably expected from most people that would work in the field. Other than that, we find a couple bilaterals, the US and Germany, lots of traditional multilaterals, again, the World Bank, UNDP, UNICEF, the IMF, and a couple more specialized multilaterals also pop up on the top 10 of footprint, WHO and FAO or FAO. On influence, we have some interesting results. Portugal performs shockingly well for such a small player in terms of influence. It comes as the second largest, most influential player for respondents that have engaged with Portugal. Again, this is not like across the board, is where they do have presence. They are seen as very influential, coming second only to the IMF, which is consistently a very top performer across waves of the survey in terms of influence. Besides the presence of Portugal kind of coming in at the very top, we have the usual suspects with a lot of traditional multilaterals being, again, seen as the most influential partners. The IMF, the World Bank, Global Fund, UNICEF, UNDP, and the US is a bilateral, and the EU that is kind of a bilateral from how we view it, because it still has kind of its own interests, unlike the traditional, typical multilaterals that we talk about. In terms of helpfulness, we again find two surprisingly small players cutting through the top 10 of perceived helpfulness in Sub-Saharan Africa. Portugal comes at the very top as the most helpful. Like nearly everyone that has worked with Portugal within Sub-Saharan Africa says that they have been helpful with the implementation of public policies. Another surprising is Ireland, that comes cutting through the top 10th in 10th position, but nevertheless, that's quite unexpected for such a small player. I feel other differences of Sub-Saharan Africa with respect to the global results is that UNDP comes pretty high, appears as the fifth most helpful player compared to the position in 10th on a global scale, and the FAO, which comes in ninth for Sub-Saharan Africa versus only 21st position in a global scale. So I think that to a large extent, the performance measures are fairly similar to global results. We have a very, very intense presence of traditional multilaterals, occasionally the US, occasionally the EU, but with these small bilateral players, Portugal and Ireland, in the case of helpfulness, really coming surprisingly with high positions, and pretty high positions also for specific kind of niche organizations such as FAO. I think this is all. I'll wrap up here. This was very brief. I don't want to take too much time. I want to devote more time to the discussion, but I hope that hopefully it gives you a sense of what types of insights we can take out of this type of data from these surveys. And I look forward to hear what our panelists think of these insights about Sub-Saharan Africa.
Thank you, Anna. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but let me clarify and emphasize up front that the panelists are sharing their individual professional views. They are not sharing official statements or views of the institutions that they're associated with. So please do ask them questions. We encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll collect those up. But to briefly introduce our panelists, we're joined by Dr. Donald Mari. He is the Executive Director of RAPOA, a leading policy research organization in Tanzania. He's an economist by training, and he brings extensive experience in development policy analysis, socioeconomic research, and institutional development. He has a PhD from the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He has an MBA from the University of Oregon and an MA and a BA in economics from the University of Dar es Salaam. Dr. Mari has played a key role in shaping Tanzania's national development policies related to governance of public and private entities, and he's published widely on topics including extractives, manufacturing, governance, social protection, the business environment, export competitiveness of agricultural commodities, among his many publications. Second, we have W. Jere Moore. He's a distinguished fellow at the Energy for Growth Hub in Washington, D.C. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development, CGD. He previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works, prior to that as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and as head of the President's Delivery Unit. At CGD, he focuses on governance, infrastructure in Africa, and the changing landscape of development finance on the continent. His research tracks the role of external actors on the continent, especially the rise of China and Africa's response to these changes. He's also a lecturer at Schwarzman College and Tsinghua University, and also at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. Last but certainly not least, we're joined by Chris Okeke. He's the governance team lead and senior governance advisor at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, in Nigeria. He provides strategic leadership for FCDO's governance portfolio, covering public sector reform, open societies, climate governance, democracy, and elections. He has over 20 years of experience in international development and has led teams delivering high-impact programs, including the FCDO's flagship Partnership to Engage, Reform, and Learn, or the PEARL program. He's widely recognized as a thought leader in governance reform, adaptive programming, and thinking and working politically. His work has shaped policy and institutional reforms at national and subnational levels and has strengthened collaboration among governments, civil society, and development partner. He holds advanced degrees in public policy and management from the University of York and international relations from the University of Warwick, and is a strong candidate advocate for locally led development. Like I said, a distinguished and experienced panel joining us today. So I have a few questions to kick off the discussion, but please do pop your questions into the chat as well. Chris, I'm wondering if we can begin with you. I'd like to hear from your vantage point, having worked with development partners on the ground. How well do partners align with development priorities of leaders from the Sub-Saharan Africa region? Or if you want to speak to Nigeria specifically, we'd like to hear about that too. If you could reflect on how development partners could improve alignment, coherence, and relevance moving forward as we think about the next decade of international development in Sub-Saharan Africa, um, please oblige us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Divya. I think, yeah, to start, in the past few years or so, we have seen a significant shift in international geopolitics. Coupled with that, we've seen the rise of emerging powers, China, Russia, India, and the rest. And increasingly, many developing countries, Nigeria, for example, um, it's really asserting its sovereign autonomy. I think all of these factors really, I don't want to say first, they're really encouraging development partners to align with the priorities of developing countries. In this instance, I would say Nigeria. But really, how should or how can they improve alignment? I think for me, the starting point really is about partnership and not a paternalistic relationship. Countries like Nigeria and many other African countries, for that matter, are interested in building genuine partnership that is based on trust, respect, and not developing partners telling them what to do or preaching to them. I think it has to start with really build around a mutually respectful, accountable relationship where policies or interventions are co-created between countries like Nigeria and development partners, where you genuinely listen and understand what it is they expect and what you offer in return. And this sort of partnership or framework should be built around, say, national development plans, for example, which are clearly articulates the country's development priorities. Again, this is very important because in the current global context, development partners are not the only players in the room. You have these emerging people powers that I mentioned earlier. I think for me, the second point really is about working with existing systems or institutional institutions within the country rather than building something which is not necessarily alien, but something that is different and will take time to work within an existing framework, and strengthening the institutional capability of those institutions to coordinate development interventions across different partners so that the developing countries or Nigeria, for example, are in the front seat, are leading those interventions, and as opposed to development partners taking the lead. I think two other points I would touch, and I'll leave it at that. Two other points I would touch would be around coordination, not competition, between development partners. In some countries, you'd see overwhelming number of development partners in the same space. In the health sector, for instance, you could see as much as 20 development partners within a space and not coordinating, or rather competing. That poses a significant challenge for the issues that you're trying to sort out. And then I think finally, on improving relevance, I think development partners need to be mindful of the politics. They need to have a clear understanding of the context and the politics, and not necessarily who to align with, but where the interests and incentives are, to be able to pitch their support and interventions around the key priorities of developing countries. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Chris. Think you've got us thinking on a lot of different fronts about how to make partnership effective. Dr. Donald, I have the next question for you. Reflecting on what Chris was just saying about being development partners needing to be attuned to the priorities on the ground, figuring out how to partner well with with local leaders. So our survey results show that good education, strong institutions, and decent work are the top three development priorities for at least half of the leaders from Sub-Saharan Africa. Can you reflect on these top priorities relative to the other sustainable development goals? And are these likely to remain the top priorities in the decade to come?
Thank you very much, Divya. I think that's true. They are going to remain quite important. And we have seen also the data that we produce, some of the survey that we do, including Afrobarometer. The priority needs that the people indicate really on good education, high quality education, given the population structure with a growing population of young people, for example, in Tanzania, close to 60% is population below 25 years of age. So that itself tells us that demand for education from this young population is going to remain a critical need over the next decade or so. But similarly, strong institutions, democratic institutions, the need for accountability, the call for inclusion, inclusive governance. We have seen challenges with young people demonstrating across different African countries, in Madagascar and elsewhere, Kenya, in Tanzania as well, recently with this turmoil that occurred on the 29th and 30th of October. The major call, if you listen, the young people are calling for justice. They are calling for accountability from the government. They are calling for transparency. They are calling for inclusion, so that their voices can be listened. And even this issue of jobs. I was even reading one discussion with the chief economist of the World Bank for Africa region. Critical priority for sure is jobs, and of course, decent jobs that are produced in sectors that ensure that earnings are sufficient, in sectors that supports productivity increase, absorb technology and digital practices, and more importantly, sustains the employment of young people, because otherwise a critical point for political stability in the long run is definitely ensuring that the private sector grows sustainably, but grows in ways that creates jobs for young people. So definitely, these are priorities for the country. I've seen this becoming a priority across the region. And even development banks are actually discussing about the issues, human capital, creating jobs, and of course, democratic governance. So yes, I do agree with what the leaders are saying.
Thank you, Dr. Donald. Jade, over to you. So, given this young population, an opportunity and a need for better work, decent jobs, good pay, and for opportunity in general moving forward, what I'm sure you've had to work with them in your past offices. What do development partners, whether they're bilaterals, multilaterals, philanthropies, companies, what do they get right in engaging with development in the Sub-Saharan Africa region? And if you had to reflect on what they get wrong, what your recommendations might be on how, whether it's countries, IOs, companies, or foundations, what can they do better in the region?
Hey, thank you, Divya, and it's a pleasure to be with William and Mary again doing the event here. I think first one has to acknowledge that there will always be an inherent tension between the providers of aid and the recipients of aid in terms of how much agency or how much voice will be given to them. When I was an undergrad in political science, my international affairs professor said that international affairs runs on the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. And so it's difficult for the ones providing the resources to surrender decision making on how the resources are going to be deployed to those receiving it. And so that tension is always going to be inherent. For example, before USAID was dissolved or whatever state is in right now, USAID remained rural heavy in its investments in Africa, even as the continent became more urban. So if they were actually listening to African leaders, then they would have we would have seen a shift in its spending more and more on urbanizing Africa than in rural Africa. But by 2030, 58% of the continent is supposed to be rural. So there's that. However, I think, as Chris was saying, something that changed the behavior of especially traditional partners has to be the rise of China. The presence of an option that African countries could approach meant that other partners had to address issues that African countries were raising, especially if they could find an option in China. So Europe's Global Gateway, the US PGII, all of these were conjured up as alternatives to China's BRI. So it means in the years before that, African governments were saying to their partners, these are the things we want. We want investment in infrastructure. And they weren't listening. But the rise of an alternative in China sort of forced them to then listen to what African leaders were saying. I think when it comes to soft infrastructure, when it comes to social investment and systems, health systems, on that, most of the Western partners have been really, and you saw in the response from leaders where health ranks really high. And if you see the spending that especially Western partners and philanthropists do, there's a significant portion of that goes to health. So on that, I think we're aligned. For example, when I was in government, the one government ministry in Liberia that qualified for reimbursements under FARA was the Ministry of Health. And the Ministry of Health meant that a significant amount of resources went into upgrading their systems and responding. More importantly, even under the Millennium Development Goals, before we did the SDGs, the one we were most in line to accomplish was the health related one. So, on that, I think African publics, African leaders, and their partners align. I think on the ones where I would suggest would be infrastructure. Dr. Donald spoke about the continent's population. I mean, the median age across sub-Saharan Africa is 19. And so you saw how high jobs were. Well, how are you going to generate jobs without the infrastructure, without the power, without the roads, without the ports? And so, but this is the part where Western leaders have not listened, where Western leaders at least have not provided resources to demonstrate that they were listening to what African leaders are asking. And this is where China has actually been pretty dominant. So I'd imagine that going forward, they will continue to do the things that they do well, but that on the things that African leaders have been asking for, that their response would be significantly better than it's been in the past. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much today. I'm mindful of the time here, so I'm gonna jump right into some of the questions we've been receiving from the audience. I'm gonna try and categorize these into some themes. Panelists, feel free to pick and answer questions that you feel you're best positioned to. Choose sections of questions. I'll let you have that, make that choice. So first couple on kind of the current scenario with aid. We have one question on given the more transactional approach to development assistance taken by the current US administration following the demise of US aid, likely to be followed by other Western donor countries. isn't this moving closer, or aren't we moving closer to China's approach through the BRI? I think the question in there is Western aid shifting to take a more Chinese flavor of aid? On a similar vein, given the volatility of aid, many people in both policy and academia are focusing again on structural transformation, historically driven by government-led industrial policies. So, in your view, how likely is it that African governments can design and implement successful industrial policy today? What do you see as the most significant challenges they must overcome to do so? So, a couple of questions there related to the current aid environment. One more related to priorities. So, one of our audience members asks, climate change clearly affects the main priorities of hunger, water, and others. Can climate change be repackaged as a key element of the main priorities within development programs? So, I suppose a question on mainstreaming climate, and this is related to how the SDGs themselves are classified. A final question on how do you expect development cooperation to evolve in politically fragile states like South Sudan over the next decade? I might queue up my colleague Anna to take this question on indicators. There's a question on what indicators do you think donors should rely on to judge whether aid is building long-term stability rather than creating dependency? So I'll leave the floor open to our panelists. Maybe I'll call on you to coordinate here, but Chris, would you like to take some of those questions, any that particularly speak to your experience?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Divya. I think I would speak to the first one on the transactional approach and the long-term stability and how you help support long-term stability. I think starting with the transactional approach. I mean, this should be quite clear, really, to many developing countries that whilst you have aid or international cooperation supporting, I think you should expect, and the event in the past year has shown really, and post-COVID actually, or I mean, during COVID has shown the importance of articulating your own strategic national interest in engagement with development partners. So my view is not just a transactional approach only. It could be both transactional. So whilst you're engaging with the likes of China or any other country, taking a transactional approach, at the same time, you should be able to articulate what matters to you and if that transactional approach is actually addressing some of your priorities. Take example, if it's about building bridges or roads, engaging with any development partner, for example, the roads that they're building or supporting you with, where is it leading to? You could, in your engagement, engage in a way that addresses your own priorities if that's the approach they're taking. But I think it's also what's also important for me at this point is really if you're able to articulate your own development challenges and your own development plan, when such offers come to you, you will be quite clear about where to channel it to and the expertise that you need to support that process. And then finally, I think on the point around what indicators to measure to support long-term stability. I think for me, the starting point you talked about in your survey, there were key points there about strong institutions, and I think for me, aid and support should not just be about the short term. So on the humanitarian front, for example, yes, whilst that is good and it addresses the immediate needs of countries, I think the starting point for me is really about are you addressing the institutional and the structural challenges that have resulted in your current position. And so the support really is about the capability of your institutions, either to deliver basic services, and is the support addressing those capabilities, addressing those challenges? Is it addressing the human capacity for your people to take that forward beyond the aid itself? And finally, I think what role are citizens playing in that process? So, for example, my experience supporting reforms in Nigeria, service delivery reforms on public civil service reform in Nigeria has been, we've seen the most result or the best result where citizens have been involved, so that when we have stopped engaging or supporting, we've had citizens pressure that has been able to sustain it, and coalitions of citizens who have been able to pick this up and run with it. So citizens and coalitions will have to be part of that process to enable long-term support and long-term ownership in that process. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chris. Dr. Donald, any thoughts on how likely it is African governments can design and implement successful industrial policy? That question just made me think of your publications, but please feel free to tackle any of the others on the table.
Yeah, I think that's something that we have discussed and in many policy cycles. And I think, and some people say, well, Tanzania, African countries cannot be China, because China really implemented some kind of industrial policy, a strong support by the state to design policies that enabled the private sector to flourish and to really transform the economy from primary to industrialized country. It is possible. There are some countries in Africa which are beginning to do this, like Ethiopia, which have really managed to the state taking a significant role in promoting certain key subsectors which they of their choice. You see significantly now Ethiopia has increased production and productivity of certain export crops, including leather and textiles. It is possible. The major challenges, of course, that requires a very strong state. I mean, in terms of institutions and capability of the technocrats to design regulations that will ensure that whatever industrial policies that are developed do not affect or stifle competition, but at the same time encouraging vital enterprises from actually to thriving, dealing with addressing a critical infrastructure gap in terms of energy, logistics, which includes ports, roads, rails, but also the critical aspect of human capital. Because these are critical requirements for private sector investment, whether from domestic or from outside, to flow and to be able to create, to develop those sectors that are possible. And it's very possible in Sub-Saharan Africa, especially where resources are abundant. We're talking of minerals, which can help develop mineral-based mineral-based industries. There are a lot of agricultural potentials which can help agro-processing industries to thrive, and many others. So that really required good set of policies, very strong and willing state and its institutions to manage to design the appropriate industrial policy, but also to ensure that implementation is in line with the aspirations, and building a condition for this private sector to grow, but also addressing these critical gaps of infrastructure skills.
Thank you for those insights, Dr. Donald. Jide, over to you. You want to tackle anything about the current aid environment and or instability, and how development cooperation may operate in politically fragile environments?
Yeah, I think first that aid is becoming transactional, or that is becoming more like China. I think it has always been transactional. Maybe it's now nakedly so, right? But it's always been. DFID was under the Foreign Office, and that's why they merged them into FCDO. State Department has always been close to USAID, and under the Trump administration, it basically merged aid into that. So aid itself is used as an instrument of foreign policy. So if it becomes more transactional, African countries would just have to adapt to the world in which they have to deal with that. And I think they're more than able to do that. I think on the issue of structural transformation, I'm glad that it was mentioned because, again, this isn't something people mention a lot in development these days. However, there was a report from the IMF from 2019, a working paper, that said that between 1960 and 2014, only 16 out of 182 countries made a transition to high income. And the countries that did that, outside of the Asian miracles of Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, were countries that found large amounts of oil, the Gulf states, countries that joined the EU. Well, if you don't have significant amount of oil and you're not going to join the EU, the rest of them that made the transition to high income used some form of industrial policy. So whether African countries can design the industrial policy or not, there is no path to escaping low income status without having some sort of a competent state that can design and implement industrial policy. And so aligning one's development partnerships or at least engagement with development partners in pursuit of structural transformation, in pursuit of transitioning away from unproductive smallholder agriculture to more industrial agriculture, or at least mechanized agriculture, and converting agricultural products into industrial goods. That's the path that we have to take. In view of this fragility and responding in fragile environments, for example, the question talked about Sudan. Certain actors would be more capable of acting in certain places than others. So, for example, in Sudan, it would be the UAE. They're exercising significant influence over what's happening in Sudan now. And so maybe they will be the partners that lead there, and there will be some kind of international pressure on the partner with the most influence to do more in that. So I think that's what's going to happen. That in some places, some partners will have significantly more expertise and competence, or at least influence to respond than in others.
Thank you so much. Anna, I'm going to throw a couple of the more survey-related technical questions that have come in. So, one, do you have thoughts on what indicators donors should rely on to judge whether aid is building long-term stability? Second, there were questions about climate change, maybe mainstreaming that with the Sustainable Development Goal or priorities of hunger and water. There are also a couple of questions in the chat related to where China shows up in the survey. So they are in our list of development partners. If you can speak to that, it'd be awesome.
Yes, absolutely. So let me go in the same order that you mentioned. So regarding indicators and plugging in some of the additional data that we didn't necessarily present here, but we also collect in the survey. We ask respondents, participants in the survey, like what makes an organization influential, what makes an organization helpful, what they value more in a development partner. And the discussion around long-term planning is definitely very relevant. It comes top of mind, like their main qualities to a good development partner provided are adaptability and long-term planning, and that is consistent across regions. I don't have a specific kind of indicators in mind, but I think another piece of data that sheds some light on how to think about guaranteeing long-term vision rather than kind of like feeding dependency is what they think should contribute to a partner that actually thinks in long-term vision. And we have respondents thinking things like building institutional capacity, prioritizing long-term impacts, etc. And it's interesting to see that specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa, the emphasis on capacity development, institutional capacity development, is actually a little bit lower. And it might be, we can speculate what is the reason for that. It might be that the development partners are already engaging with that or not, but they put more emphasis on things like coordinating with other actors in the sector or region, kind of feeding back to the discussion that was mentioned about fragmentation of donors and making sure that they were coordinating. Response Sub-Saharan Africa also more often than Then global respondents mentioned planning a transition for the end of a project or a partnership and how that transitions to like locals leading it. And they also emphasize more the conduction of feasibility assessments, all kind of like specific aspects of a project cycle, of an engagement of a development partner that may help guarantee that leads to kind of long-term success. And they're not just capacity building, that it seems that it's actually not as highlighted in Sub-Saharan Africa from leaders' perspectives as some other regions. Jumping back to the question about climate change. And also throwing in a piece of data there. While climate change is less prioritized in terms of ranking in relative terms in Sub-Saharan Africa than on a global scale, there is like, as I mentioned before, this question about the SDGs has been asked since 2017, and there is a global trend over time. There is like very large, it's massive if you compare with the other SDGs, increase in the prioritization of climate action as an SDG. Across the board. That happens globally, and that also happens in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it might just be a matter of the scale of things, right? Like we see an even larger, relatively speaking, increase of climate action as priority in East Asia Pacific. And that might have to do with the salience of climate events more recently, and that Sub-Saharan Africa is still catching up. That obviously, like, you know, the SDGs are fungible, like they're not completely isolated. One thing affects the other. And there's definitely space for development partners if it's on their interest to prioritize one area versus the other on how things are packaged, right? But just to highlight that the fact that climate action is a little bit lower for Sub-Saharan Africa than the global scale doesn't mean that they're not seeing this trend of growth of the prioritization of climate action over time. It's just there is, I think, very reasonably, a higher emphasis on some of those basic needs, such as zero hunger and clean sanitation, that in a region like Latin America and Caribbean, that has mostly middle and upper middle income countries, appears much lower on the rankings. And on China, yes, I imagine that we will get some questions about China. China doesn't capture the top 10 of any of the measures that we presented. But we do ask about China as a development partner. To give a bit of context of how China appears on this survey results, they're middle of the pack, despite this, you know, like kind of China skyrocketing as a development partner that we've seen for the past 10, 20 years. In terms when you actually measure and compare with other development donors, they're not coming comparable with a World Bank, IMF, or US. They will be, in terms of footprint, closer to a mid-sized European country like Netherlands, not Germany, Netherlands, probably lower than France. So they're more middle of the pack in terms of footprint. And even then, we ask about influence and helpfulness only for people that engaged with China, right? How they perform, it's still not great, not top of the rankings. It's still around, I want to say around the 20 to 30th in ranking. Think that we have like a long list of partners. They're really middle of the pack. That being said, is not to underestimate their role. Obviously, they come as a very different development partner with different conditions and a different way of operating from the traditional bilaterals or multilaterals. So they definitely will be changing the landscape. But how it presents in this form on how we collect the surveys, it's not drastically changing the top of the rankings immediately, even though we saw them like skyrocketing, and we see in our survey results them growing a lot from 2014 to 2017 to 2020. They actually stabilized a little bit in 2024. It slows down that growth, but obviously they represent a different type of development partner and are moving things. We'll see next waves. I think the closing of US aid is something that is more likely to change the top of the rankings. Like, what is that going to look like in 4 years? Then, for as high as it's been, the growth of China won't be that big. Aware of time, so let me head that back to you.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, just keeping an eye on the time here, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do a rapid fire of closing or final thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with. Jide, if I may begin with you, any parting thoughts for our audience?
Sure. I think the survey is necessary because it informs donors about the impressions and perceptions of the elite in the countries where they're doing this. But I would just like to close by saying that ultimate responsibility for development rests with leaders in those countries. So whether donor partners are listening to them or donor partners are not listening to them, it is their responsibility to develop their countries. And one hopes that whether the donors come or go, that responsibility remains, and knowing that they are more responsible for that than anybody else.
Thank you, Jide. Dr. Donald, your thoughts?
Yes, let me end by responding to the issue that was raised about the climate action, climate change. It's unfortunate that it appears that advanced countries are not putting a lot of attention. And recently, we saw the United States actually trying to pull out of the key uh, obligations and conventions that nations have agreed to deal with the impact of climate change. So that means the burden is likely to remain with developing countries, including us in Sub-Saharan Africa. So Sub-Saharan Africans have to really pay attention to climate change adaptation interventions, particularly to support the smallholders, farmers, to ensure that food production remains robust, because that is the key driver of prices in inflation that can undermine macroeconomic stability over the long time. It's not really easy to continue to rely on advanced economies and even some of multilateral agencies, which are themselves being weakened by the decisions of some of these large countries in terms of their climate change action.
Thank you. And over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Diva. I think let me close by saying that sub-Saharan African countries cannot afford to be spectators in a fast changing international geopolitics. I think they need to take the bull by the horn, as they say, and address those foundational issues that have kept them behind, including addressing issues of insecurity, which impacts on the achievements of many of the SDGs we've talked about. It also means addressing some of the key issues around the economy to be able to grow their pie to finance public services. And then finally, addressing the gender gap so that the entire population, not just a segment of the population, benefit from changes across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to thank all our panelists for sharing their valuable insights, sharing from the wealth of their experience. Thank you to our audience for joining early here on the East Coast of the US and late in your day across Africa and Asia. We have people joining from all over. So thanks for joining us. I do want to mention that we barely scratched the surface of the survey's capabilities. There's a lot of research that's available on our website at aiddata.org. Our hope is that by having these conversations, by listening actively to leaders from all around the globe, that we get one step closer to shaping the future of development policy based on aspirations on the ground, aligned with the priorities of citizens and leaders around the world, and not just predicting it for data analysis. Thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye, Olivia.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you very much. Good to meet you, Chris.